The concept of third world literature emerged in metropolitan universities in England and North America. These institutions have responded to various pressures by creating specific types of texts and developing new categories within the broader framework of literature. This shift is driven by an overarching ideological context that encourages the idea of a unified category of third world literature, influencing how these universities discuss and think about this category. In this essay, Ahmad explores the pressures and paradoxes that trace lines of indeterminacy, connecting these practices to their often unrecognized global influences. It sets the theoretical groundwork for examining the idea that nationalism, in various forms, is the dominant ideological force in the cultural productions of Third World during the era of colonialism and imperialism. Declaring nationalism as the main political imperative of our era, the theoretical positions of Third World literature and colonial discourse analysis risk undermining the rich history of oppositional and radical cultural productions in India, which are often influenced by communist political practice and deeply shaped by Marxism. Instead of moving away from the Marxist critique of class, colony, and empire, there is a need to build on that heritage to develop more comprehensive knowledge. The category of third world literature has emerged in metropolitan universities as a counter canon characterized by four interconnected elements: the general background and state of literary theory, the increasing availability and influence of literary texts by non Western writers, the growing numbers and social assertion of immigrant professionals from non Western countries, and the advent of a new political theory known as Three Worlds Theory. Raymond Williams was a prominent literary and cultural critic before and after the publication of The Country and the City, published in 1973. His affiliation with the left was not central to his critical work, partly due to his ambiguous relationship with theoretical Marxism. In the mid 1970s and beyond, Williams's turn towards theoretical Marxism was influenced by the introduction of continental Marxist texts into Britain through the New Left Review. This shift led him to reconsider his own intellectual framework, resulting in the publication of Keywords in 1976 and Marxism and Literature in 1977. This process of re evaluation continued with his work Politics and Letters in 1979, where he engaged in sustained dialogue with younger Marxist scholars. His work remained influential, maintaining a critical discourse that resisted the changing fashions and orthodoxies in literary studies on both the British left and in the United States. The American intellectual tradition has significantly differed from that of England since the Chartist movement. The bourgeois revolution in the United States was led by settlers against a colonial regime, establishing bourgeois hegemony before the full consolidation of industrial capitalism. This made the American Revolution more advanced in some ways than the French Revolution, but also retained retrograde elements. Its full realization extended over nearly a century, culminating in 1864 with the abolition of plantation economy and the integration of the former slave population into sharecropping and wage labor systems. English Romanticism's origins are closely tied to the anti capitalist sentiments of William Blake and the Cromwellian radicalism of John Milton. In contrast, American Romanticism was characterized by its oracular and transcendentalist qualities, exuding optimism and confidence. American modernism inherited a literary tradition from its elite past that was rarely influenced by working class energies. Instead, it was largely dominated by the boundless and somewhat Philistine optimism of New England's petty commodity products. After World War II, The cultural climate in the United States was dominated by a right wing national consensus that was both extreme and unhealthy. This consensus marginalized radical thinkers like Kenneth Burke and led to the rise of new criticism in American literary studies. New criticism emphasized the autonomy of individual literary works and viewed literature as a unique type of language that provided special knowledge. This approach to literature became dominant in American classrooms for over 25 years, serving as an effective teaching method. Northrop Frye, a critic of new criticism, shared the idea that literature was a special kind of language, but argued that individual texts needed to be understood within larger narratives. His approach influenced the development of structuralism and discourse theory, which focus on the power of overarching structures to shape specific utterances. From the 1960s onwards, the American literary scene saw the emergence of influential figures like Paul de Man and Harold Bloom. Their work was shaped by the transition from a harsh anti communism associated with John Foster Dulles to a more nuanced yet still aggressive liberal imperialism under John F. Kennedy. Dayman's ideas were controversial, partly due to his Nazi associations, but he emphasized the complexity of textual interpretation. Bloom's early work highlighted the Romantic movement as central to modern literature, extending ideas from critics like Fry and Clan Brooks and incorporating Nietzschean concepts. Bloom saw later texts as being influenced by the anxieties of earlier ones, creating a contentious field of literary production. Despite his initial enthusiasm, Bloom was unsettled by the rise of deconstruction but struggled to counter it theoretically due to his focus on literary criticism and the Romantic tradition. American deconstruction, influenced by French theory, became highly technical and politically detached. It treated texts as hermetically sealed, with their closure being essential for interpretation. This approach fostered a culture in American literary criticism that was implicitly hostile to rationalism and inclined towards rejecting Enlightenment ideals when such ideas became fashionable in Paris. Deconstructionist close reading became a specialized practice requiring extensive training at both undergraduate and graduate levels for about a decade. This methodological shift dismissed rationalism's claims to scientific objectivity and evolved into what became known as literary theory. The political climate of the time influenced this shift, and the technical hermeticism of deconstruction left a lasting impact on US literary theory. Young critics, shaped by figures like Dayman and the lessons of Vietnam War, came to form the left wing of the American literary establishment. In the 1960s, literary studies experienced a significant split. Most teachers and critics in Britain and North America continued to operate as if the dominant new criticism remained unchanged since T.S. Eliot's time. Meanwhile, a new literary avant garde emerged on both sides of the Atlantic, focusing on theory rather than traditional criticism. This shift indicated a continuity in valuing literature's specialness but introduced new analytical methods drawing on psychoanalysis, phenomenology, linguistics, and philosophy. The events of 1968 in France, including the student protests and strikes, marked the rise of a new generation of radical intellectuals and militants. This period also saw the emergence of the new philosophers, a group associated with the far right. In the United States, the anti war movement, spurred by the Vietnamese Tet Offensive, allowed people to address long suppressed social issues. The teaching of literature in the US was significantly influenced by four main developments during this period. First, anti war radicalism and civil rights. The anti war movement, combined with the preceding black civil rights movement and black cultural nationalism, this alliance led to the opening of colleges and universities to black students and faculty, promoting greater diversity in higher education. Second, broader political space. The intersection of the predominantly white anti war movement and various strands of black oppositional politics created a broader political space. This environment allowed other social groups to articulate their own agendas more prominently. Third, women's movement. Influenced by these movements, the women's movement in the USA gained momentum in the late 1960s. Women's studies programs were established across the country, and many believe that the women's movement achieved significant progress within the academic sphere. Finally, Marxism in academia. Marxism made its first substantial impact as a theoretical framework within US academia, thanks to the diverse new left that was largely based on university campuses. The trajectory of US literary criticism has been shaped by various influences, including Marxist cultural theory and issues of colonialism and imperialism. Initially, these issues were discussed not from Marxist perspectives but in response to nationalist pressures. African American intellectuals looking to Africa for cultural roots pressured for the inclusion of African literature in American literary syllabi, aligning with the rise of black nationalism. The opposition to the Vietnam War prompted critical reflections on how Western literature depicted colonies and empires. Under the influence of black nationalist pressure, African literature gained a place in American curricula. This shift spurred the development of anti colonial nationalism as a theoretical framework for interpreting Western cultural texts. Consequently, colonial discourse analysis emerged, suggesting that much of Western literature was influenced by bad faith and Orientalist distortions. Ahmad outlines the reactionary elements within Anglo American literary traditions while noting the significant changes since the 1960s. Metropolitan universities are compelled to address race, gender, and empire in unprecedented ways. However, the fragmented political landscape among radical literary scholars in the US has hindered the formation of a cohesive Marxist political or literary culture. Young literary theorists in Britain and North America, influenced by student movements of the late 1960s and early 1970s, grappled with contradictions in their radicalism. The era was marked by global revolutionary movements such as the Vietnam War, Chinese Cultural Revolution, liberation wars in Portuguese colonies, and influential figures like Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. These theorists were academically trained in the traditions of New Criticism, as well as the works of Fry, Bloom, and Paul de Man. Their radicalism also found expression in music, alternative literature, and sporadic political demonstrations. By the time these theorists began their academic careers, the global political landscape had shifted. In the US, the civil rights movement had been tempered through concessions to segments of the black middle class. The political momentum of the anti war movement waned after the withdrawal of US troops from Vietnam. In France, the revolutionary fervor of 1968 was soon quelled. The economic recessions and stagnation of the early 1970s forced social justice movements onto the defensive. Internationally, the revolutionary movements of the 1960s and early 1970s saw setbacks. Chile's socialist experiment was crushed. Cuba was economically constrained and China was largely integrated into global capitalist system. The wave of anti-capitalist revolutions ebbed by the mid 1970s with new revolutionary states facing economic circlement and destabilization by foreign interventions. In the post colonial world, the focus shifted from revolutionary change to strategies for integrating into the capitalist global order. In this context, radical thought in universities pivoted from socialist revolution to third world nationalism. This shift was first evident in political theory and then in literary studies, leading to the emergence of the category third world literature and a focus on colonial discourse analysis. This theoretical framework directed attention away from future oriented revolutionary change toward a historical critique of colonialism. During this period, nationalism was identified as the primary ideological force in the Third World by thinkers influenced by post-structuralism. Avant-garde theorists posited that post-structuralism and deconstruction were essential for critiquing nationalism. Despite claims to the contrary, magical realism did not become the dominant literary mode of the post-colonial world. Instead, national allegory became a common feature in the rhetoric of metropolitan theory. Developments in literary theory have complicated the political landscape, particularly in addressing issues of empire, colony, and nation. Radicalism's primary focus shifted to rejecting rationalism, which was central to the Enlightenment project. This intellectual movement has led to a critical reassessment of past narratives rather than forward looking revolutionary theories.